October 14, 1968. Consolidated Motors Assembly Plant. Number 6, Detroit, Michigan. 6:02 a.m. The whistle blew at 6 in the morning, the way it had blown every morning for 31 years, which was before most of the men on the floor had been old enough to work, and the sound of it had become over those 31 years something closer to a biological event than a signal, something that the body responded to before the mind had finished waking up. The men came through the gates in the October dark, lunch pails in hand, breath visible in the cold air that came off the river with the specific cold of a city that understood winter and was already preparing for it months in advance, a cold that carried the smell of steel and water and the particular exhaust of a city that ran on combustion engines and had been running on them long enough that the smell had become inseparable from the idea of the place itself. They moved to their stations with the efficiency of people who have done the same thing so many times that the doing has become a kind of disappearance, the self receding into the motion until the motion is all there is, and the self is somewhere behind it, present but not required, along for the ride that the body takes without asking. The plant produced 412 vehicles on a good day. On a bad day, it produced 390, and the difference between a good day and a bad day was not machinery or materials, but the specific quality of attention that 47 men could sustain across an 8-hour shift when their feet hurt, and the ventilation in Sector 4 was inadequate, and the fluorescent lights above the line had been flickering since Tuesday, without anyone from maintenance coming to replace them. The men knew this. They knew that they were the variable in the equation, that the machinery was fixed, and the materials were fixed, and the quota was fixed, and the only thing that could be adjusted was them, their attention, their pace, their capacity to sustain both across 8 hours of standing on concrete in a building that had been designed for the production of vehicles, and not for the comfort of the people producing them. They had known this for long enough that the knowing had settled into the body, along with the whistle, something absorbed rather than considered, part of the background of the thing rather than a feature of it that required ongoing processing. Arthur Mead knew it too, which was part of what made him effective and all of what made him intolerable. Arthur Mead was 53 years old and had been plant supervisor at Consolidated Motors Assembly Plant Number 6 for 11 years. Before that, he had been assistant supervisor for 6 years, and before that, he had been a floor manager for 4. And the trajectory of his career described a man who had risen through the structure of the plant the way certain things rise through structures, by finding the path of least resistance and following it with the patient persistence of something that has neither conscience nor hurry. He was not unintelligent. Unintelligent men do not manage the production of 412 vehicles a day for 11 years without something going catastrophically wrong. He understood logistics and scheduling and the mechanics of throughput in the specific way that men understand things they have spent 2 decades doing, which is to say completely, and without needing to think about the understanding, the way a pianist understands the keyboard. What he did not understand, or had decided not to need to understand, was the difference between a man and a unit of production. This was not an oversight. It was a methodology that had served him well for 11 years in a plant where the men could not afford to make it, not serve him. He arrived at 7:15 every morning in a car that cost more than most of his workers made in 4 months, parked in the space closest to the entrance that had his name on a sign that he had installed himself in 1961, and walked the floor with the slow, deliberate pace of a man touring property he owns. He wore a suit on the floor, which was unusual in a plant environment, and which communicated exactly what it was intended to communicate, which was that the floor was a place he passed through rather than a place he inhabited, that his relationship to the machinery and the noise and the concrete was fundamentally different from the relationship of the men who spent 8 hours a day in direct contact with all three. He carried a clipboard and made marks on it as he walked, and the men on the line watched the clipboard from the corners of their eyes, the way soldiers watch a commanding officer's expression during a briefing, trying to read in the marks what the marks would mean for them personally and for the people working beside them. He spoke to the men in the specific register of a man who has decided that the people below him in the hierarchy are there because they belong there, which is a register that is not quite contempt and not quite condescension, but occupies the space between them, with the comfortable residence of something that has never been required to justify itself. He called them boys, regardless of age. He referred to their concerns as complaints. When a man raised a safety issue, he described it as sensitivity. When a man asked about the ventilation in Sector 4, he said the plant was built to a standard, and the standard was adequate, and if the standard was not adequate for the man in question, then perhaps the man in question was not adequate for the plant. He said this with the pleasantness that was his particular instrument, the pleasantness that communicated that the dismissal required no effort, that the man raising the concern had not succeeded in making himself sufficiently significant to warrant genuine engagement. He had said something like this to Henry Kowalski in March of 1967, when Henry brought a signed petition from 31 workers about the fumes in Sector 4 that had been giving men headaches since the new paint process was installed in January. Henry had brought the petition carefully, had thought about how to present it, had rehearsed what he was going to say in the break room the evening before, with 2 men who had helped him collect the signatures had stood in Mead's office doorway, with the papers held out in front of him like something fragile, like something that might be damaged by rough handling. Mead had looked at the petition, had looked at Henry, had said, in the pleasant voice, "If 31 men in Sector 4 cannot handle the standard working environment of an American automobile plant, I suggest 31 men in Sector 4 find employment better suited to their constitutions." He had said it with the particular pleasantness of a man for whom the dismissal was not personal, which was somehow worse than if it had been personal, because personal would have acknowledged that what was being dismissed mattered to someone. Henry took the petition back to Sector 4 and set it on the break room table and sat down and looked at it for a long time. The 2 men who had helped him collect the signatures sat beside him and also looked at it. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say that the petition had not already said, and that Mead had not already answered. The headaches continued through April and into May, and by June the men in Sector 4 had developed the specific adaptation of people who have decided that a problem they cannot solve must be reclassified from a problem into a condition, from something that requires a response into something that simply is. The wages at plant number 6 were the lowest of any Consolidated Motors facility in the state of Michigan. This was a documented fact available to anyone who asked the union, which had been attempting to renegotiate the contract for 3 years without meaningful movement. The men knew it. They discussed it in the break room and in the parking lot, and at the bars on the east side of the city, where the plant workers gathered on Friday evenings to drink beer they could barely afford, and talk about a situation that talking about did not change. The wages were low, and the hours were long, and the conditions were what they were. And the man who controlled all three was Arthur Mead. And Arthur Mead was not interested in any of those things changing, because the things that made the men's lives difficult were the same things that made his production numbers look good to the people above him in the corporate structure, who determined whether Arthur Mead continued to occupy the office with his name on the parking space sign and the window overlooking the floor. The specific arithmetic of dependency was something every man on the floor understood, without being able to articulate it as arithmetic. They needed the job, not in the abstract way that people need employment for psychological fulfillment or professional development, or the social structure that work provides, but in the immediate and specific way that men with mortgages and children and aging parents and medical bills need money to arrive on the 15th and the 30th, or the structure of their lives collapses in ways that are not abstract and are not temporary, and are not the kind of difficulty from which recovery is straightforward. Detroit in 1968 was not a city with an abundance of alternatives. The auto industry was the economy in the way that a river is the landscape, everything else arranged around it, dependent on it, shaped by the fact of its presence in ways so complete that the dependence had become invisible, the way the dependence on water is invisible to people who have always had it. To lose a position at a plant like Consolidated was not to begin looking for something better. It was to enter a category of difficulty that most of the men had watched their fathers inhabit and had spent their working lives trying to stay out of. Not because they were afraid of difficulty in the abstract, but because they had seen what that specific difficulty did to specific men over specific years, and they did not want that for themselves, and did not want it for the people whose lives depended on theirs. Mead understood this too. It was the foundation on which everything else he did was built. The contempt was sustainable because the dependency was real. A man who cannot afford to leave cannot afford to push back in any way that might result in being shown the door, which meant that Mead could do what he did with the confidence of someone operating in an environment where consequences have been structurally removed. He had tested this understanding over 11 years with the patient incrementalism of a man who knows he has time and is not in a hurry, because not being in a hurry is itself a demonstration of the power that allows it. He had reduced the break period from 20 minutes to 15 in 1963, with a memo that described the change as a productivity alignment. He had cut the annual tool allowance by 40% in 1965, with a note about budget reallocation that was 4 sentences long and answered no questions. He had installed a monitoring system on the bathroom breaks in 1967 that logged the time each man spent away from his station and produced a weekly report that Mead reviewed and occasionally referenced in individual conversations in ways that were designed to communicate that he was watching, that the watching was continuous, that the space between the surveillance and its consequences was a space he controlled and could close at any time he chose. The men endured these things the way men endure things they cannot change, which is by developing around the unchangeable thing a kind of internal architecture that keeps it from destroying everything else. They made dark jokes in the break room that transformed humiliation into material for entertainment, which was a form of reclamation even if it changed nothing about the humiliation itself. They developed a shorthand for Mead that communicated contempt without ever saying the word, a shorthand that required no explanation among men who shared the same floor and the same hours and the same particular quality of exhaustion that comes from sustained work under conditions designed by someone who does not experience those conditions. They looked out for each other in the small ways that people look out for each other when the larger situation is beyond their individual power to address, covering for a man who needed an extra 2 minutes in the bathroom, warning each other when Mead had been seen moving toward a particular section of the floor, sharing information about which supervisors from the corporate office were coming through on which days and what their visits meant for the rhythm of the work. Joseph Crane had been on the line at plant number 6 for 9 years. He was 34 years old, compact, and dark-haired, with the kind of face that had absorbed experience without being hardened by it, which was unusual enough in a plant environment that it was noticed by the men who worked near him without being commented on directly, the way unusual things in familiar environments are registered and filed rather than discussed. He listened carefully in a way that was different from the way most men listened in break-room conversations, which was the listening of men waiting for their turn to speak. Joseph listened as though what was being said contained information he needed and had not yet finished extracting. He was interested in things beyond what he was required to be interested in, and had been since before the plant, which the men who had known him longest understood as a fact about him, the way his height and his hair color were facts, simply part of what he was. He read on his lunch break, which in the culture of plant number 6 was eccentric enough to be remarked on, but not eccentric enough to be held against him, because the things he read and the things he talked about in the break room were things that connected to the actual conditions of their actual lives. And a man who talks about things that connect to your actual life is a man you find yourself listening to, even when you did not plan to listen, even when you came to the break room, intending only to eat your sandwich and rest your feet for 15 minutes before the whistle called you back. He had been listening to Mead for 9 years, not the way the other men listened, which was the defensive listening of people trying to anticipate the next indignity, so that the anticipation softened the impact. He listened the way he read, which was for structure, for the logic underneath the surface, for the specific mechanics of how the thing worked and what kept it working and what, if anything, would cause it to stop working. What he had concluded over 9 years of this kind of listening was that Mead's power was not the power that Mead believed it to be. Mead believed his power derived from his position in the corporate hierarchy and from the dependency created by the economic structure of the city around the plant. These things were real, but they were not where the power actually lived. The power lived in the men's belief that the situation was fixed, that the dependency was permanent, that the architecture of their circumstances was as immovable as the machinery on the line. Mead had spent 11 years carefully maintaining that belief, carefully and continuously, and with the attention of a man who understands that the belief is the thing, that the machinery of his authority runs not on the formal power vested in him by the corporate structure, but on the ongoing conviction of the men on the floor, that the formal power cannot be meaningfully challenged. If the belief changed, the rest would change with it. He had understood this for a long time. The question was what it would take to change the belief, and whether he was the person to do it, and whether the moment for doing it had arrived or was still somewhere ahead, visible only as a shape on a horizon that the current position did not yet bring into focus. He had watched the petition fail in 1967 and had understood the failure not as evidence that the situation was unchangeable, but as evidence that the method had been wrong. A petition gave Mead a single object to reject, and a single man to make an example of, and a single moment to use as instruction for every other man watching about what happened when someone tried. He had watched 2 men fired in 1966 for what Mead called insubordination, and what the men on the line described with a specificity that made clear that insubordination in Mead's language meant something much narrower than insubordination in any other language, something closer to the specific act of being present in the room as a man, rather than as a function. He had attended union meetings for 3 years and listened to representatives discuss leverage and timing and the long game, with the growing recognition that the long game had become its own accommodation to the situation, a way of doing something that produced the feeling of action without requiring the thing that action was supposed to eventually produce. What he had concluded, and what had taken 3 years to conclude because he had wanted to be certain before he moved, was this: Mead's method required the men to respond to each indignity individually, in isolation, in the defensive posture of people trying to minimize damage. Each man in his own calculation of what he could afford to risk, each calculation arriving at the same answer because the inputs were the same inputs for all of them. Each man's dependency, a separate weight that kept him in place separately from every other man's dependency, even though all the dependencies were produced by the same system and maintained by the same man. The method worked because it prevented 47 men from becoming something other than 47 separate men. It kept them parallel. And a parallel line of men, each one doing the calculation alone and arriving alone at the conclusion that silence was cheaper than speaking, was a line that Mead could walk past every morning with his clipboard and his suit and his pleasant contempt and never feel the way you do not feel a line of parallel wires, because a line of parallel wires carries nothing from one place to another. What would happen if the parallel became something else? What would happen if the calculation changed? Not for one man, which produced a petition or a fired worker and was absorbed by the system without changing it, but for enough men simultaneously that the system encountered something it had no method for absorbing. He had been turning this over for 3 years, waiting for the moment when the conditions were right, when the thing that needed to happen would happen in a way that the moment supported rather than a way the moment had to be forced to accommodate. He had learned from watching Mead, among other things, that timing was the difference between a thing that works and the same thing attempted at the wrong moment that does not work and cannot be attempted again in the same way. He had waited. October 14th, 1968 was not a day he had circled on any calendar. It was the day the conditions arrived. Arthur Mead walked onto the floor at 10:47 in the morning, which was unusual. His standard floor inspection happened at 9 o'clock, and his afternoon review happened at 2:30. And departures from this schedule were themselves a form of communication, a reminder that his presence was not predictable and could not be prepared for, that the normal order of things was an order he established and could disrupt whenever he chose, and for reasons he was not required to explain. He walked the line with the clipboard and the suit and the slow, deliberate pace, stopping at stations, looking at work in progress, making marks, occasionally addressing a man in the pleasant, dismissive register, the register of a man for whom the men on the line exist, primarily as data points in a production narrative that he is continuously authoring. He stopped at Station 11, where a man named Gerald Webb was working a press that had been producing a half-millimeter variance in the door panels for 2 days. The variance was within the acceptable range on paper. In practice, it meant that the doors on the finished vehicles would close with a slight resistance that customers would eventually notice and complain about, and that would generate warranty claims that would come back through the system as a data point in Mead's quarterly review. The review that determined the budget and the staffing levels and various other things that flowed from Mead's performance numbers in ways that affected everyone on the floor. Gerald had reported the variance on Wednesday. Maintenance had not come. He had reported it again on Thursday. Maintenance had still not come. This morning, he had left a written note on the machine log and attached a copy to the daily report that went to Mead's office, following the procedure precisely, doing the things the system told him to do when a machine required attention. Mead looked at the press, looked at the log, looked at Gerald Webb with the expression of a man reviewing work that falls below a standard he has established and is taking a moment to communicate his assessment before moving on to the next station. "Seems like you have been having trouble keeping up with the spec on this press," Mead said. His voice was pleasant, in the specific way that made pleasant worse than any register that acknowledged what it was doing. "Might want to consider whether this station is the right fit for your particular skill set." Gerald Webb was 51 years old. He had been at Plant Number 6 for 16 years. He had a daughter in her second year at Wayne State University, on a partial scholarship that required the rest of the tuition to come from somewhere. And the somewhere was Gerald's wages and the savings account that the wages had built over 16 years of showing up before the whistle and leaving after it and doing the work that the station required. He had a son who had come back from Vietnam 14 months ago and was living in the back room of Gerald's house and was working at a gas station 3 days a week and spending the other 4 days in a state that Gerald described to no one because there were no words for it that were both accurate and bearable. He stood at the press and looked at Mead and said nothing, which was what he always said, which was what all of them always said, because nothing was the only response that could be made without risk, and risk was the one thing none of them could afford. The floor went quiet in the way it went quiet when Mead stopped at a station. The machines continuing their noise, but the human frequency underneath, dropping to something close to silence. Every man within earshot, performing the practiced invisibility of people who have learned that visibility in these moments costs something, and the cost is not predictable and not proportional, and not something that can be avoided once it has been incurred. Joseph Crane was at Station 14, 12 feet from Station 11. He was working the body panel alignment, a task that required sustained attention and usually absorbed him in the specific way of work that demands enough precision to occupy the mind without requiring it to do anything it finds interesting. The state that the men on the line spent most of their 8 hours inhabiting. He was not absorbed this morning. He had been watching Mead walk the floor since 10:47, with the quality of attention he had been bringing to the situation for 3 years, the attention of someone who has been waiting for a specific configuration of conditions and is watching to see whether this is the configuration. He watched Mead at Station 11. He watched Gerald Webb's face, which was the face of a man containing something with the effort of someone who has been containing it for a very long time, and is approaching the place where containment requires more than is available. He watched the men within sightline performing the invisibility, directing their eyes at their work with the deliberate focus of people trying to be elsewhere while remaining physically present. Joseph Crane set down the alignment tool. He turned from Station 14 and walked toward Station 11. The walking itself was unusual enough that 2 men looked up from their work before he had taken 4 steps. A third noticed the 2 and looked up also. By the time Joseph had crossed the 12 feet between his station and Gerald's, 7 men had broken the performance of invisibility and were watching him move across the floor with the attention of people who are not sure what they are watching, but understand that it is something that requires watching. He stopped beside Gerald Webb. He looked at the press for a moment, at the machine and its log and the note Gerald had written that morning and attached to the daily report according to the procedure. Then he looked at Arthur Mead. "The variance on this press has been reported twice this week," Joseph said. His voice was at the specific level of a voice that is not performing calm, but actually is calm, which sounds different from performed calm and communicates differently. The difference between a surface and the thing beneath it. Maintenance has not come. Gerald Webb has done everything the system asks a man to do in this situation. He documented the problem. He followed the procedure. He did it correctly and twice. The system has not responded. That is not a problem with Gerald Webb. Mead looked at Joseph Crane with the expression of a man encountering a variable that is not part of the model he is operating from. The expression lasted approximately 2 seconds before the professional composure reasserted itself, the composure of 11 years of operating in an environment where this kind of variable did not appear, and the composure had never been required to do anything more demanding than maintain itself against the friction of ordinary complaint. He looked at Joseph with the pleasant dismissiveness, applied now at slightly higher pressure than usual, the adjustment of a man increasing the dose of a remedy that has always worked before. "I do not recall asking for your assessment of the situation at Station 11, Mead said. "No," Joseph said. "You did not ask." He paused. Not the pause of a man searching for words. the pause of a man who has the words and is choosing the precise moment to release them. That is part of what I want to talk about. The floor had gone quiet in a way it had never gone quiet in 11 years of Arthur Mead walking it. Not the quiet of individual men performing invisibility. A different kind of quiet, the kind that requires nothing from the people producing it, that comes from the fact that something is happening that has not happened before, and the people present for it understand this without being told. The machines continued their noise. Underneath the machine noise, nothing. "I suggest you return to your station," Mead said. His voice was still pleasant, but the pleasantness was doing more work than it usually had to do, and the effort was faintly visible. Joseph Crane did not return to his station. He looked at Mead for a moment with an expression that was not hostile, and was not performative, and was not designed to communicate anything except the fact of his presence and his intention to remain present. Then he looked at the floor, at the men in sight line of Station 11, at the faces that had turned toward him. "Every man on this floor," Joseph said, and his voice was pitched to carry the length of the floor without being raised, which is a different thing from shouting and produces a different effect because it does not ask the voice to do what shouting asks it to do, which is to compensate through volume for the absence of something else. Every man on this floor has a family, has a mortgage or a rent payment that arrives on a schedule that does not adjust for inconvenience, has someone whose ability to eat and be warm and see a doctor depends on the money that this plant provides. Arthur Mead knows this. He has built everything he does in this building on the fact that we know it too, and on the further fact that knowing it keeps us in a particular position. He looked at Mead briefly, without hostility, the look of a man naming a fact rather than making an accusation. He has built 11 years of this on a single calculation. The calculation is that the cost of speaking is always higher than the cost of silence. That each of us, alone, will always choose silence because silence is what we can afford, and speaking is what we cannot. Around the floor, men were turning from their stations. Not all at once. One, and then after a moment another, and then two more together, and then three, the way attention spreads through a space, when the thing happening at the center of the space is more significant than anything happening at the periphery. When the calculation of what requires attention shifts, and the shift is visible enough that it moves from person to person without requiring communication. "He is right about the math," Joseph said. He was not looking at Mead now. He was looking at the men. One man speaking is a problem Arthur Mead knows how to solve. One man he can dismiss, or threaten, or walk to the door, and the walking to the door becomes its own communication to every other man on the floor about what happens when a man decides that speaking is something he can afford. He has done this. We have all watched him do it. We have watched it and taken the lesson and added it to the calculation and arrived at the same answer we always arrive at, which is that silence is cheaper. He paused. The silence that followed the pause was the silence of people who recognize something they have thought about, alone being said out loud in a room full of other people who have thought about it alone, the specific recognition of a private thing becoming shared. That math only works if we stay separate, if each man keeps doing the calculation alone and arriving alone at the same answer. He paused again. "I have been doing the calculation alone for 9 years. I am not doing it alone anymore, and I am asking whether anyone else is done." The silence lasted. Arthur Mead opened his mouth. Joseph Crane looked at him with the expression of a man who has anticipated the interruption and has already decided that the interruption is not the thing that requires his attention. Mead closed his mouth. Gerald Webb, who was 51 years old and had 16 years in this plant, and a daughter at Wayne State, and a son in the back room who was not entirely back, turned from the press at Station 11 and stood beside Joseph Crane. He did not say anything. He did not need to say anything. The standing was the entirety of what was required, and he provided it completely. David Park at Station 9 turned from his work and stood. David Park had a wife whose medical condition required medication that cost more than he could comfortably provide on his current wages. And he had known this for 2 years, and had said nothing, and made the calculation every month, the way you do a calculation that always comes out the same way, and eventually you stop doing the calculation and simply accept the answer, even though accepting it is its own kind of cost that does not appear in the numbers. He stood beside Gerald Webb and Joseph Crane and looked at Arthur Mead. Robert Sellers at Station 3, who had filed 3 safety complaints in 4 years and watched all 3 enter the administrative process and produce nothing on the other side, turned from his station and stood. Then 4 men turned together, from stations along the middle section of the line. Then 3 more. Then the men at the far end of the floor, who had not heard Joseph's words because the machine noise covered them at that distance, who had seen the turning and understood from it without needing the words what was happening and what was being asked, turned also. One, and then another, and then a cluster, the way things release when the thing holding them in place is removed, when the variable that made the answer come out the way it always came out, is no longer in the equation. By the time the last man turned from his station, 39 of the 47 men on the floor of Assembly Plant Number 6 were standing away from their work and looking at Arthur Mead. 8 men had not turned. Some of them would carry the weight of that for a long time afterward. Some of them had reasons that the other men understood and did not hold against them. Mead looked at the floor. He looked at it with the expression of a man whose model has produced a result the model did not predict, and who is in the process of understanding that the error was not in the calculation, but in the assumptions underlying it. He had assumed the individual calculation would always produce the individual answer. He had been wrong about what was individual. The clipboard was in his hand. He had not made a mark on it, since Joseph Crane had walked away from Station 14. He looked at the clipboard as though he was not sure what it was for. He looked at the 39 men. He looked at Joseph Crane. Joseph Crane looked back at him with the expression of a man who has said what he came to say, and is now simply in the room, present in the situation the saying has produced, not pressing, not adding, simply there in the way that the outcome of a completed action is simply there, waiting for the world to catch up to what has already happened. Mead walked off the floor at 11:09 in the morning. He walked past Station 11 and Gerald Webb, and past Station 14, and past Joseph Crane, and through the section of floor where 39 men were standing away from their work, and out through the bay doors into the October air. He did not use the pleasant dismissiveness. He did not make eye contact with any of the men he passed. He walked with the pace of a man exiting a situation that his methodology does not cover, and for which no contingency has been prepared. A pace that was not quite hurrying, but was not the slow, deliberate ownership of a man touring property he owns. The machines on the line continued to run. Nobody was operating them. They ran the way machines run when the people responsible for them have stopped being responsible for them for reasons the machines cannot register, producing their noise into a floor that was producing a different kind of noise, the noise of 39 men exhaling something they had been holding. Mead went to his office. He sat at his desk. He looked through the glass partition at the floor and at the men who were beginning, one by one and then in groups, to turn back to their stations. Not because anyone had told them to, but because the thing that had needed to happen had happened, and the work was the work, and the work continued. He watched them return to the machinery and take up the positions and resume the motions. And he watched the resumption with an expression that no one in the office with him that morning could have described precisely afterward, only that it was different from any expression he had worn in the 11 years of walking that floor. The process that followed over the next 6 weeks was not simple, and was not fast, and was not without difficulty and uncertainty, and moments when it seemed that the thing that had happened on October 14th would not produce the outcome that it pointed toward. There were meetings with people above Mead in the corporate structure, conversations in offices that did not have floors like the floor of plant number 6, and with people who had not stood on a floor like that one in years, and who needed the situation explained to them in language that translated the experience into terms their experience could accommodate. There were meetings with the union that were different in character from the previous 3 years of meetings, because the character of a negotiation changes when one side has demonstrated something the other side previously believed was not demonstrable. There were conversations among the men on the floor, in the break room and in the parking lot, and at the bars on the east side, that were different from the conversations that had preceded October 14th, in ways that were not easy to specify, but were immediately recognizable to anyone present for both kinds, the way air is recognizable as different after rain, even when the rain has stopped and the sky is clear. Arthur Mead submitted his resignation on November 29, 1968. The letter was 1 paragraph. It cited personal reasons and expressed gratitude for the opportunities provided by 11 years of service to Consolidated Motors Corporation, and wished the company continued success in its operations. It was the letter of a man who understands that the thing that ended his tenure is not a thing that can be named in a resignation letter, because naming it would require acknowledging that 39 men turning from their stations on an October morning had been sufficient to end something that 11 years of carefully maintained individual calculations had sustained. The letter named nothing. It was, in its way, the last exercise of the pleasantness that had been his instrument throughout, the pleasantness applied now to the work of departing. Joseph Crane was appointed interim plant supervisor on December 3, 1968, pending a formal review process that was completed in February of 1969 and resulted in his permanent appointment to the position at a salary that was higher than Mead's had been, which was something the people above the plant in the corporate structure had decided was appropriate, and which communicated something about their assessment of what had happened and what it meant for how the plant would need to be run. going forward. He was 34 years old, which made him the youngest plant supervisor in the history of the Consolidated Motors Michigan operations, a fact that was noted in the internal announcement and that the men on the floor received with the specific satisfaction of people for whom a number is not just a number, but a communication about what is valued and by whom. He moved into the office with the window that faced the floor and looked through the glass partition at the line and the men working it and spent a long time looking at it before he did anything else. He looked at it with the specific attention of a man who has spent 9 years on one side of a glass and is now on the other side, and is taking the time to understand what the change in position reveals about what was visible from each side and what was not. The view from the office showed the floor as a system, as a set of relationships between stations and movements and materials and outputs. The view from Station 14 had shown the floor as a collection of men, each one a person with a history and a calculation and a limit and something on the other side of the limit that the calculation was designed to keep him from reaching. Both views were accurate. He intended to hold both of them simultaneously. The first thing he changed was the monitoring system on the bathroom breaks. He had it disconnected before the end of his first week. He did not issue a memo about the disconnection. He did not call a meeting to discuss it. He simply had it disconnected, and when men noticed that the log was no longer running and mentioned it to each other in the break room, it was mentioned in the way things are mentioned when the mentioning is itself a form of registering, a change that is too significant to leave unregistered, but that does not require discussion. The second thing was the ventilation in Sector 4, which had been a documented problem since January of 1967, and which had generated a petition in March of the same year that had been dismissed with a sentence about constitutions. The maintenance work was completed in the third week of December at a cost that was less than 1% of the quarterly facilities budget, a cost so small relative to the problem it addressed and the time the problem had gone unaddressed that the smallness of it was itself a kind of statement, though Joseph did not present it that way and did not need to. The men in Sector 4 noticed the difference in the air before the maintenance crew had finished packing up their equipment. One of them, a man named Carl, who had been in Sector 4 for 11 years and had signed Henry Kowalski's petition in 1967, said to the man working beside him, "Same air, different air." The man beside him said nothing, but looked at Carl and then looked at the ceiling where the ventilation had been serviced and nodded once in the way of a man acknowledging something that does not require elaboration. The third change took longer and required conversations with people in the corporate structure above the plant, and produced a contract renegotiation that proceeded through January and February of 1969 and was completed in March with a wage adjustment that brought Plant Number 6 into alignment with the other Consolidated Motors facilities in the state of Michigan. The men received the notification of the adjustment on a Tuesday morning before the whistle, distributed by hand at the gate, a single page with the numbers on it. Most of them read it standing in the parking lot before they came through the gate, in the October cold that by March had become the specific cold of a Detroit winter preparing to release its hold. Some of them read it twice. Some of them said nothing, and folded the page and put it in their jacket pockets, and went through the gate and to their stations, and began their shift. The saying nothing was not the silence of men who have decided that silence is cheaper than speaking. It was a different kind of silence. Joseph made these changes in the order required, which was not the order of the most dramatic or the most immediately visible, but the order of the most structurally sound, the order that communicated to the men that the calculation had changed, and that the change was not temporary and not contingent on circumstances that might reverse, but built into the structure of how the plant now operated. He had spent 9 years watching a man construct a system and had understood from the watching exactly how such a system is constructed, what it depends on, where its load-bearing elements are, and where the elements that appear structural but are not. To take it apart required the same attention to structure that building it had required, applied in reverse, beginning with the elements that communicated to the men that the assumption on which everything else rested had been replaced by a different assumption, an assumption that treated the calculation differently, that removed from the calculation the variable that had made silence always cheaper than speaking. Gerald Webb's press was serviced on December 5th, 1968. The maintenance crew came in the morning and worked on the press for 2 hours, and when they were done, the variance had been corrected, and the press was producing door panels within the required specification with no deviation. The doors on the vehicles produced at Station 11 from that day forward closed with the specific solid sound of a component fitting properly into the space it was designed to occupy, a sound that customers did not notice, because customers do not notice the things that work correctly, only the things that do not. On the morning of December 3rd, 1968, Joseph Crane walked the floor for the first time as the man whose name would eventually be painted on the sign in the parking space nearest the entrance, though he did not paint his name on a sign and the parking space remained unmarked for the duration of his time at plant number 6. He walked without a clipboard and without a suit, in the work clothes he had worn for 9 years, at the pace of a man moving through a space he knows completely and is seeing from a position he has not occupied before, and taking his time with the seeing. He stopped at each station. He looked at the work. He spoke to each man by name and asked questions about the work and about the machinery and about the things that were working well and the things that were not. And he listened to the answers with the quality of listening that the men had known for 9 years, which was the quality of listening that treated what was said as information rather than noise, as something worth having rather than something to be managed on, the way to a conclusion that had already been reached. When he reached Station 11, he stopped and stood for a moment beside Gerald Webb and looked at the press that had been serviced 2 days earlier and was now running correctly. Gerald Webb looked at him. Neither of them said anything. The line moved around them, the machines doing the work they were designed to do, the morning moving through itself the way mornings move when the things that need to be in place are in place, and the work can be what work is when it is done by people who have not been asked to be less than what they are. Then Joseph Crane moved on to Station 12 and 13 and 14, the station he had stood at for 9 years, and he looked at it from the position of a man who no longer occupies it, and understood from that position what it had been and what it had cost. and what the men who still occupied stations like it were doing every morning when the whistle blew, and what it meant to do that work under conditions that acknowledged it as work done by people, rather than output generated by a variable. He moved on down the line. The morning continued. The whistle had already blown. The work was the work, and it continued as it had continued every morning for 31 years, and as it would continue, differently now in the ways that mattered, and the same in the ways that were simply what the work was. This story is a work of original fiction, set against the historical backdrop of American industrial labor in the late 1960s. Any resemblance to real persons or companies is coincidental. If this resonated with you, subscribe and leave a like. New video coming soon.